Hello, everyone. My name is Eleonora Tafura Ambrosetti. I'm a research fellow with the ISPI's Center on Russia, Caucasus, and Central Asia. Welcome to this new episode of our Ukraine Conversations. Today, I'm joined by two excellent guests. Olga Oliker is Crisis Group's Program Director for Europe and Central Asia. After many years in the US, occupying several prestigious positions, Olga is now in Brussels. Welcome, Olga.
Thank you. I am very pleased to be here.
We have also an old friend of ISPI's, Galip Dalay. He's a fellow at the Center for Applied Turkey Studies, cats, which is a very appropriate name given Turks' love for cats. The center is located at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SVP, in Berlin. Welcome, Galip.
Thank you very much.
So due to logistic issues, we are recording this event, so we won't be able to take your questions, but I'm sure we'll be covering many and very interesting points in the conversation. Also, I encourage everyone to engage with our guests on their Twitter. They're both very active Twitter users, so please make sure to follow them. We have half an hour and we have many important things to discuss. So I'll start immediately with Olga. Olga, a few days ago, Dmitry Peskov, he was acknowledging the human tragedy facing Russia with all the casualties that Russia has suffered in this conflict. So what are we seeing on the ground? Are we seeing Russia losing this war? What are the what can we say from the outside? How is this war going?
So the actual fighting has quieted down substantially in recent days since the Russians have started moving their forces, and they promised they would move their forces out of Kiev and northern Russia, with the intention of focusing their military effort in the east on Donbass. So they have been moving forces, and the Ukrainians have also been reallocating forces to the south and the east, although they are hesitant. They're nervous that there might be new attacks on Kiev, so they're trying to decide just how to reallocate. But the result has been a lot less actual fighting in the meantime as everybody repositions. So to take the place of constant reports of new fighting, we have instead had the uncovering of what looks a lot like atrocities, what appear to be the results of war crimes carried out by Russian forces while they were in control of territory around Kiev and in the Chernihiv Oblast. So that has been capturing attention. And then, of course, we also had an attack, a rocket strike on the train station in Kramatorsk in the east. But so far, we have not actually seen a real revamping of the fight. So the big question right now is how good are the Russian forces going to be once they're concentrated, right? Because the concentration is a recognition that their original plan of a simultaneous advance along four axes was based on an expectation of a very friendly Ukrainian population, which of course they did not get, and what the Ukrainian capacity to both defend against them in Donbass and potentially even to counterattack, and also to be able to split the Russian attention by keeping up a fight in the south will be. So we're all fundamentally waiting for the fighting to start again.
Well, you spoke about war crimes, but how likely is it that Russia or Putin will be held accountable for that?
So the people who get held accountable for war crimes are people who leave power and lose wars, both. If you lose a war and stay in power, probably nobody is ever going to bring you up on war crimes charges. And if you win the war and stay in power, nobody is ever going to bring you up on war crimes charges. This is the problem with international law, is that it's voluntary. So unless a country subjects itself to it, which Russia has not, which incidentally the United States has not, nobody's going to get prosecuted. The investigations, however, of allegations of war crimes, of what certainly look, at a distance, and it's quite a distance, like war crimes, I think is a valuable thing to do, even if there won't be prosecutions, or even if prosecutions won't happen for some time to come. I think simply for the historical record, it's important for the survivors, it's important. And I would also say that in doing this, one also has to investigate accusations of war crimes that we've seen against Ukrainian forces, such as abuses of POWs. And again, it's really just a question of making sure that the record is clear. And then if people can be held accountable, look, if Ukrainians do hold accountable any of their own people who committed such crimes, then that is an important step forward for them as to build a responsible and accountable nation state. If one day Russia chooses to do that as well, I think that's something many of us would applaud, just simply on human rights grounds. But, for the kinds of, we will see them in The Hague sorts of statements, I'm not holding my breath.
Thank you. Galip, what's your take? How is this war going? And also, how is this war perceived in Turkey, both at the level of political elites and population? Because according to a recent survey, roughly half of the Turks surveyed seem to blame NATO for this war. Do you agree with this view? Is it something that you think is plausible?
Well, I think first, how is the war going? As also Olga put, it seems that Russia, Putin miscalculated several points. One of them is the capacity of the Ukrainian to resist. Secondly, the accommodation of the Ukrainian people of the Russian occupation. And thirdly, the severity of the international response to this invasion as well, too. And perhaps one might also add the capacity of the Russian army itself. So right now we see that there has been miscalculation almost in all of these points. So the resistance has been stronger than perhaps Putin has expected. The Ukrainian rejection of Russia has been much deeper and far-reaching than Russia has expected. And I don't think that Russia has expected that level of international response and that we have seen. Perhaps they expected a bit more than the Crimea 2014, but it doesn't seem to be that they have expected that much. And also the Russian army has not been advancing as much as they have been advancing. We should still not, make the assumption. We should still not come to the conclusion that actually Russia, let's say, militarily has failed. Russia still can exact a very significant cost on Ukraine and still can take, many places that we are talking about or still under the Ukrainian control. But nevertheless, the level of the miscalculation on the part of Russia has been significant. So how this war is reverberating in Turkey, both at the population and the elite level. At the elite level, obviously, the Turkey has several concerns in this regard. Perhaps, after the Russia and Ukraine, the country that is being affected, at least one of the countries that is being affected the most in this war is Turkey, because this war is taking place in Black Sea. It's dramatically and drastically redesigning the regional balance of power and then regional geopolitics in Black Sea. And Turkey is a major Black Sea power. So in this regard, it has several levels of looking at this bilaterally. This is reshaping the Turkish relationship with Russia, Ukraine, but also the Turkish relationship with the West. We recently see quite a positive dynamics in Turkish-Western relationship, and that's a largely result of the war in war in Ukraine. This is driving Turkey and the West to some extent closer. We saw the exchange of messages, exchange of diplomats in Turkish-US relations. Similar goes with Turkish-European relations. And Turkey still tries to kind of, manage with ties with Russia. It tries to not to be outright anti-Russia. It tries to make sure that it is pro-Ukraine. So in a sense, it has engaged in a very difficult balancing in this area. The thirdly is the global level. Obviously, what does it mean for the global order, or what does it mean for the international system? Because in the end, almost all Turkish-Western relationship has always been primarily driven by the global level developments rather than, let's say, bureaucratic processes. We can take this from the late Ottoman period all the way to the modern Republican period. So this is changing Turkey's place in the international system, Turkey's place vis-a-vis the West as well too. At the popular level, as you put it, a significant amount of the population hold NATO responsible for what is happening as well too. I think this is to some extent. I am seeing a similar reaction in many other countries as well too. In Europe, the level of holding NATO responsible seems to be significant in several other places, in Balkans, etc. as well too. To some extent, this is the result of the very toxic climate in Turkish-US relationship. And obviously, the NATO is largely seen through the US perspective. So when you see people saying NATO, that effectively means they mean US. But is this a sentiment or is this a policy position? Are two different things. This is more of a narrative and sentiment. But if you ask the other questions, you see that this is not a proposition for policy position, because what you see actually, what is more important, almost at all level, the Turkish societies right now, the one that are advocating for closer relation with Russia, or the one that sees Russia as a partner, in all these questions, the support or the support is going down significantly. I think one of the significant outcome of this war is how the Russian place in Turkish public imagination is changing. And it is changing dramatically. You see the drop in the level of support for all these points. But as I said, Turkey continues to be a highly NATO suspicious country, and then the growing divergence with Russia has not translated itself into convergence with the US at the popular level. At the policy level, we already see more exchange, more positive signs between Turkey and the US. But at the popular level, the divergence with Russia hasn't translated itself into a conversion with the US in Turkish public opinion.
That's very interesting. Also very interesting that you point out at the anti-US sentiment that it's also very widespread here in Italy. And we recently published a survey about what Italians think about the conflict. And there was also a substantial percentage of Italians blaming NATO for this war. I mean, it is very interesting in Turkey, but
it's very interesting. At the same time, like for instance, the level of support for NATO in Turkey across the board is going up. So that's why I'm saying, we have to make distinction when we talk about it. The distinction between sentiment, narrative, and policy. They can be something, but they might still find it rationally useful. And I think this is to some extent the distinction that we see. And also at the time when you see the anti-US sentiments, the US, anti-US sentiment to be high, you also see a growing support for the EU frameworks, the European institution in general. So that this is a very important development.
Thank you for that. Olga, during the conflict, several veiled but also quite outspoken threats were made by Russia in terms of use of nuclear weapons or direct confrontation with the US. But how likely is it that we will face this very grim scenario?
So I would say there are two scenarios for nuclear use. One is a scenario in which no NATO member states gets directly involved in the war, and Russia uses a nuclear weapon simply to demonstrate to the Ukrainians that this could get much, much worse. But if they do that, that will draw NATO member states into the war, because if you use a nuclear weapon anywhere in Europe, the literal fallout, depending on the winds, but almost certainly will affect both Russia and NATO member states. So NATO is going to see, I think, the use of a nuclear weapon in Europe as an attack on Europe as a whole, including NATO members. What Russian saber-rattling talk reminders that Russia is a nuclear weapon state, threats about getting into its way, etc., have to do with is what happens if NATO member states gets involved, and this turns into a direct war between NATO members and Russia. And in that case, you are looking at a war where Russia is not crazy to think about it as an existential war, because NATO is more capable than Russia, because Russia has seen how NATO fights as an alliance and how NATO members fight. And it very much will expect attacks on Russian territory, efforts to change its government, efforts to eliminate its capacity to retaliate, including with nuclear weapons, all of these things which Russia views as existential threats, which in Russian official doctrine permit the use of nuclear weapons. So I think, if there is a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, the risk of nuclear use becomes very, very real. So I think the risk of nuclear use absent that is not non-existent, but very small. And the risk of nuclear use, if you have a war between NATO and Russia, is terrifyingly substantial.
That's quite worrying indeed. But let's go to much optimistic scenarios, one in which we find a solution. And in recent days, we've seen Turkey gaining prominence as one of the most credible facilitators that could help bring a diplomatic solution to this conflict. So, Galip, you've authored a very good CNN article in which you say that Turkey is in a unique position to mediate, and I am 100% with you on this. But at the same time, we are not seeing very concrete and tangible results, are we? So I wanted you to assess the state of the diplomatic process now and the role of Turkey in it.
Well, I mean, in the same article, I also, said that this conflict is not ripe, unfortunately, for mediation yet. And then Russia is more interested in the talk of mediation rather than the actual mediation. And I think this is still the case because the Russia still seems to be hell-bent on the idea of a military solution. Because Russia still feels that it hasn't achieved any of its set military goals. And I think as long as this is the case, perhaps Russia would be interested in mediation processes, in the talk of the mediation, in the mediation meetings, but I don't think that they will be interested in actual mediation. And but any country that is trying to mediate at this stage, I like that the Russia would welcome it. The Israeli try it, Russia, put an openness towards it. The Turkey try it. We might see, the Chinese signal it. We might see countries like India also down the road playing a role. So the number of the countries that would be interested in some form of mediation or intermediation or facilitation, because I'm not sure whether what we are seeing is really a mediation at this stage. And as I said, Russia highly likely will keep a door open for this kind of efforts. But I don't see Russia being interested in these efforts in any serious ways, because the mediation efforts gives the image that Russia is interested in a diplomatic solution. And it is also the Russia, in a way, the Russia is trying to tell the West, at a time when there is an diplomatic efforts, why do you put sanctions on me? So in a sense, this is also to some extent designed to incentivize, part of the countries in the West not to go for this regime, for this sanction regime as much, to the fullest extent. And the mediation is also serving all the mediator countries' interests as well. So first and foremost, this is a projection of the international stature for any country that is trying to mediate a global crisis of that magnitude. But also, if you look at all these mediating countries, the mediation to some extent is a cover balancing act. Because when you mediate, it becomes more easy for you to continue, or become more feasible for you to continue with your balancing act between Russia and the West for some times as well too. As I said, the Israeli was interested in such a role. The Israelis effectively has engaged in a balancing act between the Russia and the West, try to not to take a very strong or outright anti-Russian position. The highlight that we might see Indians has taken very much like a balancing act in this relationship too. And the Turkey is, as I said, clearly pro-Ukraine, because it sells armed drones to Ukraine. It closed its straits for the warships. It calls to what is happening as invasion and war, but it has refrained from joining the sanction regimes. It has refrained from closing its airspace to Russia. So in a sense, that Turkey is trying to be pro-Ukraine without becoming anti-Russia. And to some extent, this mediation efforts is also serving this purpose as well too. So I think we had this debate during this process, one on fence sitting. Many countries was fence sitting. I think the fence sitting was, in a sense, for many countries, an adaptation to a new world in which there are different centers of powers, which is not as Western-centric as it used to be. And mediation, to some extent, is a cover balancing act. But I don't see right now the prospect for mediation to be promising anytime soon. Because it seems that Russia is still very much focused on a military solution.
Olga, what's your take on this, and especially on what Galip was saying about the Western efforts, mediation efforts, or lack thereof? Can we have sanctions and weapon deliveries to Ukraine and a diplomatic process at the same time?
Yes, of course you can. And I think what the Western states could be doing a better job of is signaling that if there's a success on the diplomatic track, if there's an agreement, then there might be some movement on at least some of the sanctions. But I think it's somewhat ridiculous to say that just the very willingness to talk should get sanctions lifted or shifted in any way. I don't think that would be a realistic expectation. And I agree that this isn't mediation. This is shuttle diplomacy, which is fine. It's necessary. Shuttle diplomacy and hosting periodically. That's fine, right? These sides don't need a mediator. It's not that they don't understand each other. They understand each other perfectly well. They are also both, I think at this point, looking to see what they can do on the battlefield before they decide what they're willing to make concessions on, which, again, is a reasonable position, though, not great if you're people in the line of fire, though most of the people in the line of fire being Ukrainians seem okay with their government taking this position, right? So that's also something to take into account. So I think what we're seeing is negotiations that are intended to leave the door open, that are intended to send signals, that occasionally are intended to send up trial balloons to see how publics in Russia, Ukraine, and globally will respond to different ideas, but they're not negotiations that are going to lead to an agreement anytime soon. And I think over the next few weeks, when the fighting resumes and we see how that goes, we'll have a better sense of how likely negotiations are to move forward in the future.
Thanks for that. Turkey hasn't joined the collective West in imposing sanctions against Russia, but I think the economic consequences of this conflict will be felt in Turkey as well. So Galip, what's your assessment on the economic dimension of the conflict for Turkey?
I think for Turkey, and also we should extend this conversation to beyond Turkey for non-Western world, because one thing that we have been discussing is the consequences of this war in terms of soaring energy prices, soaring food prices, etc. And that also translates itself, what is the cost of this conflict for different countries? And I think this is precisely the difference, asymmetry in this cost of this conflict for different countries that determines their position as well too. Because the cost of this conflict, let's say for some in Western Europe might be inflation going up, but some in Africa that might mean famine, that might mean dying. And so therefore, I think right now, one thing that is very much lacking, missing in the Western debate, how to deal with this cost of the war for different countries. Because like effectively, if this war drags on for longer, we might see a quite large scale of people dying because of the hunger, etc. So actually, we need an international compact to address the war effect on the fragile countries. Like in a sense, what we did with COVID, there needs to be an international effort that will offer solution or aid packages to the countries that will be dramatically and drastically affected by this. Because when you look at a country like Somalia, it is almost completely dependent on Russia and Ukraine for its grains and wheats. Like Egypt is more than 70% is dependent on Russia and Ukraine. So therefore, the cost of it, the economic impact of this war, is different from countries to countries. And it is the asymmetry in this cost. As I said, like, for someone maybe in Germany, that means adapting to yourself to a life that will be more expensive. Even sometimes it might be colder. But for some in Africa, that might mean like bracing for perhaps a famine for several countries. In the case of Turkey, we have to make distinction between actively participating in the sanction regime or passively being obliged to apply the outcome of it, to comply with the outcome of it. So Turkey is not actively joining the sanction regimes. And it's unlikely to join the sanction regimes because Turkey is over-dependent or overexposed to Russia, both in terms of the economic and geopolitical realms. Economically, Russia is the largest source of grain, tourist, energy for Turkey. So we can go on, and that's pretty much will be very difficult for Turkey to not to pay attention to this dimension. Secondly, Turkey has usually often stated, even in the past, that it usually complies with the sanction that is approved by the UN. And obviously, in this case, this is not possible. Russia is in UN Security Council, sitting in the UN Security Council. And thirdly, this is the Turkey is engaged in Russia directly through different conflict zones, Syria, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, etc. So in a sense, Turkey has to look at this crisis from a regional and global perspective, but also through its bilateral fragilities vis-a-vis Russia through different conflict zones. For instance, a Russian attack on Poland means a Russian attack on NATO countries, and that's supposed to trigger, that should trigger a collective NATO response. But a Russian attack on a Turkish military post in Syria doesn't necessarily have to trigger a NATO response, because this is not covered by the NATO security guarantees. We previously see the Russia attacking Turkish soldiers. We saw this most glaringly in February 2020 when Russia killed 36 Turkish soldiers. And obviously this did not trigger a response from NATO, because the NATO doesn't see this area as being covered by its security commitment. So therefore, the Turkey is highly unlikely to join any of the sanction regimes. But what I see, that Turkey might be forced to comply with some outcomes of these sanctions, because the sanctions are so systemic. given the nature of the banking system. So the Turkey would be perhaps passively implementing the outcome of some sanctions. And then the cost of this war, even without Turkey joining it, is already going up dramatically for Turkey. As I said, the Turkey is a heavily tourism-dependent country, and then Russian and Ukrainian makes almost 30% of the Turkish tourist population, and that pretty much means, a loss of it. So Turkey is like many other countries, perhaps more than many other countries. The economic bill is going up, but as I said, we sorely need an international conversation what the meaning of the cost is for different countries in this war.
Well, Galip was talking about different vulnerabilities of some countries, such as Somalia or other African countries, to the economic consequences of sanctions and the war more broadly. But I think also in the collective West, within the collective West, we see different vulnerabilities, not only between EU countries and the US, but also inside the EU. For instance, if I think about energy, Italy or Germany are, of course, more dependent and more exposed to Russian threats in this domain. So, Olga, one last question for you. How strong do you see this Western alliance that has been strengthened, of course, due to the conflict? But in the future, do you see this unity being reinforced, confirmed, or will we see some divergences showing up again?
So I think we often set the bar for unity a bit high. There's this expectation that unity is lost if one member of the alliance or the overall alignment takes a step forward and everybody doesn't move in lockstep with them. Oh my God, there's no unity. If some countries send anti-tank weapons and other countries send bulletproof vests and helmets, oh my God, there's disunity. You know what? The Ukrainians need both, so it's okay. It's all part and process. And I think the Russians are going to help with the unity, to be completely honest, because whatever they do next and whatever of what they've done before gets uncovered as time moves on, it's going to energize anger at them and thus support for Ukraine among Western states, and Western states broadly defined. So I'm not all that worried about the unity, but, I'm of the minority opinion. I wasn't all that worried about the unity for the last 8 years either. We had, before this escalation, right, the war that was continuing before that, every 6 months the European Union voted on the sanctions package for Russia and prolonging it. And there was like, oh my God, will they vote for it again? Yes, they will vote for it again. They have voted for it every 6 months for years now. They will continue to vote for it. And now, again, we have this, is there unity? Will everybody move in total lockstep? Everybody will not move in total lockstep, but they are pulling in the same direction, and they're going to continue to do that.
Well, on this positive note, we will finish our conversation, thanking, of course, our two guests, Olga Oliker and Galip Dalay. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation, and I hope to see you again in person, hopefully very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.